I think sometimes as a fundraiser in particular, we feel our job is to sell an organization. And actually, I don't think that is the job. I think the job is to partner with people who want to solve problems and show how you're part of that solution and play a meaningful part in that solution. And then the resources will flow. It comes back to this idea of if you really understand what, and we're talking about a discrete audience of wealthy individuals, particularly first generation wealth creators, what they're looking for, then it is about being catalytic. It is about perhaps being a bit more business-like and entrepreneurial. They had the data, it proved that it worked, they started to scale up, they built their business model, and within 7 years, they've impacted almost 50 million kids across Africa in various different business models and are participating in this outcomes contract, which is a partnership between governments. And that all sounds massively macro and big, but it all started really, really small with some people going, okay, well, we can't do this on our own, so let's partner up with other people and just start the conversation and work out what we can do together.
Hey there, brave fundraisers. Welcome back to the Fundraising Bright Spots podcast. This is episode 157. My name's Rob Woods, and this is the show for fundraisers who want insights, stories, and maybe even a dose of inspiration to help you raise more money and really enjoy your job. And today, we're looking at high-value philanthropy, and in particular, asking this powerful question. What are the factors that truly make the difference as to whether or not wealthy people choose to make a major gift to a good cause? As I said last time, the person I've learned most from in this area is Tom Hall. Tom is Managing Director, Global Head of Social Impact and Philanthropy at UBS. He started out as a fundraiser working within charities, and for over 10 years now, he's worked for UBS. In this time, he's had the chance to have conversations about philanthropy with more than 4,000 high net worth individuals. That's an average of more than 7 a week for 10 years. As I said last time, this means he's had a completely different number of philanthropic conversations to learn from compared to any other fundraiser I've ever met, and indeed compared to when he worked in-house at Scope and the National Literacy Trust. And he's used this opportunity to gain valuable insights into the patterns that affect whether a would-be major donor does or does not make a game-changing donation. In our first conversation, Tom talked about how crucial impact and measurement are to the donors he has met. And in this conversation, he talks about how and why they value sustainability and the implications of this for charities. We've already had lots of great feedback about Tom's previous conversation, and I know you're going to find this one just as interesting. So welcome back, Tom. Last time you told us various things that many philanthropic investors tend to be thinking about and talking to you about, and a major theme there was how they're looking for impact. But you also started to touch upon the importance of sustainability and scalability, many of which are not instinctive or easy to some charities. But I wonder if you could just start us off there from the point of view of many wealthy people who are philanthropically minded. What's going through their head? And indeed, why might they see risk if there is no exit strategy, if the charity might be coming to them again and again?
So I think one of the big concerns I've seen over the years with wealthy individuals is they don't want a charity to become dependent on their funding. And actually, one of the first meetings I had when I was at UBS about a decade ago was a guy who'd been taken around a local hospice and was told, if we don't get $1 million, we will shut. So he gave them $1 million, and they were like, we're going to do this and this and this to become more sustainable, which he took at face value. It's a year later or 2 years later, they basically called back and they said, we need $1 million or we're going to shut. He said, what about the sustainability strategy? No, but you kept us open. And if you don't give it again, it's going to be your fault. So, just like the kind of almost that guilt, that sense of guilt. And there's various derivations of that. You see people, set up a school or something, and the school's entirely dependent on them to keep funding it forever. And if they don't, then it will shut and nobody will get help. So you'll have a reverse in any of the impact you may have achieved. So people are very nervous about that. I think they're also nervous about opportunity cost. If I give it to this organization, maybe I could have got more impact in this one. And one of the ways I think people have tried to address that over the years is, and you see it with trusts and foundations, is they'll say, oh, we're going to give to you 3 years and 3 years only, which is a way for them to feel less guilty when they cut your funding in 3 years' time. But it doesn't really address the issue because you're passing the baby around, essentially. Somebody's got to fill that gap. Unless you can make a real case that actually what you're asking for isn't revenue funding forever, it's investment to lead to some form of exit. And really, there's only three types of exit, I think, in the whole nonprofit or social impact world. One is some kind of, you actually solve the problem entirely. So, one example I often use is in the anti-trafficking space. Actually, it's illegal everywhere. We just need people to follow the laws. We need governments to implement the laws properly, and we need to lock up the bad guys. And then we should be able to massively reduce, for example, sexual slavery in certain contexts, right? It's never probably going to be eliminated entirely, but it doesn't need to be the huge problem it is. And that may require a one-off or a multi-year investment to make sure you're actually changing the system and improving how everything works in that context. But once you've done that, you shouldn't need to keep funding it because the system will function properly. So that's one kind of exit strategy. But, for other issues which aren't going to get solved in that sense, they're more like ongoing, let's even call them human rights, like the right to healthcare or an education. As long as we keep having babies, you're going to keep needing a throughput of people who need those services, and therefore philanthropy can't provide those things at scale. So you can help a very, very few number of people with your philanthropy in the macro scheme of things, and you can help them really well. But you probably can't really, one philanthropist is not going to deal with the fact that 256 million 9-year-olds globally can't read and write, right? Like, to fix that, you need to do that at a government level or in the private school sector, right? Like, you have to come up with scalable, sustainable ways of addressing that. And that's where I think, when we're going out to ask for resources, we need to be able to articulate what our sustainability and or scalability rationale are. I mean, the only other potential sustainability rationale is an endowment, but that's very, very capital intensive and not particularly efficient. But that has actually worked quite well for universities. They've been brilliant at raising money and go, give me $1 million, I'll do one scholarship forever for another kid, right? If it's Harvard. Maybe a bit more efficient at a university in Rwanda, but still potentially not as efficient as if you used all the capital. So, just using that example is something we're talking about a lot now is, well, instead of locking up $1 million in an endowment and only doing one scholarship at Harvard for one kid a year at 50,000 or maybe 10 at the University of Rwanda, if I lend that entire $1 million to students in Rwanda over a 10-year period, I probably can do, something in the order of 500 students. So I can get many more times the impact than if I use the old model, right? Because the capital's recycled. Those students will repay their student loan in an income share agreement over a period of time. So instantly, I've improved the return on investment, the cost per outcome from 1 to maybe 50 to maybe 500 just by changing the business model of how I'm asking for you to deploy your capital. So you can probably see how that's going to be more attractive. If you don't have a particular geography or focus area to invest in, you want to maximize your impact. Of course, you're going to go for the one where you recycle your capital and help more people.
Yeah. And in terms of the listeners getting their heads around this and the kinds of conversation they might have internally to get super clear on what the theory of change is and or maybe more innovative in what the proposition might be that the donor might fund. I don't know what other examples you could share. I mean, maybe the first one that I remember is when you were working at Scope, something about the proposition changed and that actually did more good.
Yeah, it comes back to this idea of if you really understand what, and we're talking about a discrete audience of wealthy individuals, particularly first generation wealth creators, what they're looking for, then it is about being catalytic. It is about perhaps being a bit more business-like and entrepreneurial. So therefore, you can kind of create that opportunity. So at Scope, what we realized was, for example, we had a great evidence-based service that had good data that if you provide support for families who just had a newly diagnosed disabled child, the outcomes for that child will be better because there was quite a high degree of, family breakdown and all these kinds of things. So supporting families at that point, better outcomes for the child. And I think roughly that service, let's say it costs £500 per child per year to provide that support. So if somebody gave me 50,000, I could do 100 families, right? I could provide that service to, but that's it. What happens after that? Well, I need to give another 50,000 and another 50,000, and you're becoming dependent on the donor. But what we realize is if you invested the 50,000, for example, into setting up a charity shop, that charity shop, if you set it up right, could generate almost 50,000 of profit inside a year. So that meant you could actually repay the philanthropist and support 350 families for the same investment. And then that was hugely differentiating. So, because instead of having to go, well, you need to support my cause because we're better than that cause, we could say, hey, you can support my cause. I'll give you your money back. You'll help way more people. And then you can give to the thing that you like, right? So I mentioned this thing about opportunity cost. You've actually completely eliminated opportunity cost, really, because you're allowing people to use their money more than once. So that kind of concept was interesting. And we even did that, believe it or not, where we borrowed money from foundations and institutional investors to invest in fundraising. I mean, because there's a predictable ROI on fundraising. Now, not something that people particularly find attractive, but again, why not? And there's a great talk online by a guy called Dan Pallotta on Charitable, where he did that as well. He made a real case for unrestricted money being invested in fundraising and the exponential impact of building out sustainable fundraising mechanisms like a big charity run that didn't exist. Now, that is harder today than it was 25 years ago because it's a really crowded market space. But there's innovation opportunities there. There are things that one could do that may be a bit left field that are actually more attractive because there's a business element to it that will appeal to the audience.
And there's another example that I still remember from the last time we spoke. I think it was something like a solar suitcase, which really was targeted at solving a very specific problem and then basically followed this path you've just described?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that was, again, another example of where an organization called Solar Suitcase, their theory of change, and this is this idea of theory of change, like how do we have impact, and a theory of scale, how do we do it at scale? Because to be honest, without scale, you're not really going to address things like the Sustainable Development Goals, some of the big social and environmental problems that we're facing. And that is a motivation, even if not fully articulated by wealthy individuals. They want to see scale. And there's two dimensions to that. One is everyone is aware that they don't have enough money to solve issues on their own, unless they're picking a very small problem. But if they're starting to go, well, I really care about poverty in the UK, or I really care about climate change, or, I'm really worried about the fact that 50 million kids are not in school globally. How can I address that? There'll be an awareness that even if you're Jeff Bezos, your 170 billion probably isn't enough for you to solve maybe even one or two of those problems on your own, let alone all of them, right? So if we look at philanthropy globally, I said earlier, it would be 10 trillion by the mid-2030s. But to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we already know we need 30 trillion. To get to net zero, we need 50. So what that means is we do actually need to use that 10 trillion of philanthropic capital, not to kind of give people a free education or free healthcare and try and, that classic adage, give them a fish. We have to catalyze whole systems of fishing. We have to change the system. We have to create investable pathways. And that investment can come from public money or it can come from the markets, but it's got to come from somewhere if we're going to drive it to scale. And a great example of that happening, talking about solar panels, is the early kind of R&D that went into things like solar panels was done with philanthropic capital at universities and is now being scaled by investors. And just continuing to find ways to replicate that pathway is part of, I think, what the non-profit world can do with donor money and what philanthropists are looking to do. And Solar Suitcase was just one example of that. They were like, we actually think one of the major issues around infant mortality in emerging markets is women give birth at night. And actually, if you ever tried to provide clinical support for 10 women in the dark, it's really hard and you basically miss stuff. What they discovered through a randomized control trial was that if you could put light in a clinic, you massively reduced infant and maternal mortality because you could actually just see who was needing care, who was bleeding to death potentially quietly in the night, right? Like really visceral, simple stuff. And therefore, from that data, they said, right, well, we need to find a cheap, cost-effective way of putting solar panels into rural clinics that aren't on the grid. Let's do them with solar in a box, essentially. So they did that, they implemented that, they did the randomized control trial to prove its efficacy, and that data was then bought by the EU government, who decided to scale up solar panels into 2 different countries off the back of that control trial, all starting from an idea, right? And I think that's the power of this. If you kind of think about it sequentially and strategically, as you can go from an idea to scaled impact in millions, if not billions, and get the investors who want to help you do that, just by really thinking about that from the outset. What's your theory of change? What's your theory of scale?
Hey there, this is Rob, and I wanted to quickly let you know about our 2 long-standing courses designed to help you grow high-value fundraising results. That's the Major Gifts Mastery Programme and the Corporate Mastery Programme, which are starting again from October 2024. Of course, I could tell you all about them myself, but it might be more interesting for you to hear from someone who's experienced one of these courses. So here's some feedback we received recently from Naomi Campbell from a charity called Fields of Life, who took part in the most recent Major Gifts Mastery Programme.
It was amazing. I've worked now in the charity sector for about 8 years, and it's the best training that I've done in my time working in the sector. I think for me personally, it was about having the confidence and the techniques that you taught so practically and interactively and in such a fun way to really build my own confidence. I think I've noticed a huge shift in my own mindset when it comes to fundraising and working with major donors that has just allowed me to enjoy my job so much more, really. Trust fundraising can feel quite lonely at times, so to have that camaraderie, that group of people who are just willing you well, that you can learn from each other, safe space to bounce ideas off each other, and then leave the room feeling more inspired, more determined, more encouraged to do the best job you can. I think tons of value in that for me.
To find out more about either Corporate Mastery or the Major Gifts Mastery Programme, go to brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. For now, let's get back to my conversation with Tom.
So, Tom, let's say a listener works for a charity where it does seem, and maybe there's data yet, maybe there isn't, but there is an intervention that is very effective, but they would love for their organisation to get really bold and ambitious in what the sustainability plan might be. What would your advice be for how they build that out, or who they talk to, so that even in the conversation with the philanthropist tomorrow, that this is part of the narrative?
I recognise that depending on where people are at in an organisation, this can be really quite a hard thing to do. But I actually do think it's the right internal advice to give an organisation to try and get investment into driving your impact and the potential scale for an organisation. And actually, one of the elements to be honest about is what you can do and what you can't do. And I think one of the terms that we talk about a lot now is collective impact. So let's say, for example, you're focused, on trying to improve mental health, for example, in young people. Are you going to be able to do that all on your own? Most likely not, right? You're going to have to partner with government, or you're going to have to partner with other organisations, and being able to then clearly articulate what your value add and role is in a partnership is actually quite powerful. And it could be, if you're from a smaller organization, that actually maybe you do have an innovation that you're going to be more nimble and able to implement and test that a big organization can't. And by partnering up together, you might actually then have access to other philanthropists that you don't get access to, or government funding that you don't get access to. So I think that concept of kind of really starting with, what is the problem we're seeking to address, and then working down from then what is your unique potential intervention into addressing that problem, but not over-promising and under-delivering, which I think is something that's quite common in the charity sector. We often go, we're amazing, fund us, and we're going to have this incredible exponential impact, and that does put donors off. I've seen people be very frustrated by that. So I think that realism about what your role can be, and then genuinely building partnerships, and to give you a sense of kind of how, again, the time value of relationships is so important. That's important with your donors, but it's also important with partnerships. So we started building partnerships back in 2014, 2015 on this idea of pay for results. So saying we want to see governments paying for impact because we think they're wasting money. In fact, we did a survey in the US from the Treasury Department, and they estimated that of the best part of $1 trillion they spend every year on health and social care, only 1% is evidence-based, i.e. randomized control style standard. A lot of it is just, they do it because they've always done it, or it's the cheapest, right? So this idea of getting public money to be more results focused has been a big idea that the whole sector has kind of been behind probably for about a decade. And we wanted to do more of that in emerging markets. So anyway, cut a long story short, over a 5-year period of building partnerships, doing examples of these results-based contracts, about 4 years ago, had a big announcement, US government, UK government, of about a $400 million contract, which enabled us to raise $100 million to invest in things like education in rural Ghana, really, really, really poor kids who normally you'd be just, it's the realm of philanthropy, was actually being invested in a fund structure whereby the returns to the investors are being paid by governments on a results basis. And that is literally the work of lots of different organizations in partnership, including the very small, one of the very small partners, nonprofits that we're working with in that particular contract, didn't even exist 7 years ago. They had an idea that actually their learning model, which was delivering education with not even a teacher, a literate 18-year-old through an iPad, would be more effective than the poorly qualified teacher. And they had the data, it proved that it worked, they started to scale up, they built their business model. And within 7 years, I think they've impacted almost 50 million kids across Africa in various different business models, and are participating in this outcomes contract, which is a partnership between governments. And that all sounds massively macro and big. But it all started really, really small with some people going, okay, well, we can't do this on our own. So let's partner up with other people and just start the conversation and work out what we can do together.
And that's an amazing example. I'm also guessing it's not for the faint-hearted. It's going to require real clear thought, resilience, getting out there, bit of luck, not giving up again, all of that. But maybe someone listening to this might have a strong sense, and hopefully the data, that their intervention is that good, that effective, and that might cause them to go out and quite deliberately try and get into conversations with those potential collaborators.
Exactly. Look, it's not like this was the only thing we tried. And if you told me 7 years ago that was the one that would work, I might not have believed you, right? So sometimes we try multiple different things. Some work, some don't. You learn lessons from the things that don't, just as much as you learn. In fact, sometimes you don't learn the right lessons from the things that work because you think it's going to always replicate and be true. But I think sometimes as a fundraiser in particular, we feel our job is to sell an organization. And actually, I don't think that is the job. I think the job is to partner with people who want to solve problems and show how you're part of that solution and play a meaningful part in that solution. And then the resources will flow, right? If you can answer that question, why us, in the micro as well as in the macro, then I think resources are much likely to flow than if you just are trying to kind of show what you do and it's really good. I think the motivation, particularly when we're talking about philanthropists, of genuinely addressing issues at scale in a way that's provable.
It's a lot of what I get when I hear you talk is the importance of differentiation and curiosity personally and in the culture internally of seeking an answer to that question, why us? And the harder we seek that, notice it or a glimmer of it when we see it, and then going on to do other things you've talked about in both these episodes about impact and sustainability and conversations and collaboration. Lots follows from that hunger for the differentiating thing. Tom, I'm really conscious of time. You've been so generous and helpful with these examples and pieces of advice for our listeners. So I'm going to let you get away. But for now, thanks ever so much for coming on the podcast. And I look forward to our next conversation. Bye, Tom.
Thanks, Rob. All the best. Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you found Tom's insights helpful. If so, and you've not already listened, I really recommend you also check out our original conversation, which is episode 156. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes, which you can find in the podcast section of our website. Now, I know there's a good chance you've already subscribed to the Fundraising Bright Spot show, but if not, please do press that button now. You get instant access to our entire back catalogue, including to that earlier one where Tom shares more great stories and smart tips to help charities increase major donor income. If you find our podcast useful and you think it would help other people, please do share it on with your team or with other charities. My team and I put a lot of effort into creating these free resources, and I'm always so grateful when you're able to share them on so that they help more people. And if you'd like to find out more about our two famous programs, that's the Major Gifts Mastery Program or the Corporate Mastery Program, which have now helped many hundreds of fundraisers to grow income over the last decade, do check out the information on our website, brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. Do let us know what you think about the show. We're both on LinkedIn, and on X or Twitter, I am @Woods_Rob. Finally, thank you ever so much for listening and supporting our show. As always, I wish you the very best of luck with your fundraising, and I look forward to sharing more Bright Spot stories with you very soon.